And welcome to this episode of Guitar Dudes. I'm John,
I'm Brian.
and we are talking about the British invasions. We're doing a three-part series. We've already talked about part one in the swinging 60s. Part two, we talked about the groovy 70s. And now we reach the climax of it all, the excellent 80s. You call it what you want. I was trying to think of something that kind of rhymed, but we're going to talk about the 80s, specifically the second British invasion. You know, when I thought about the British invasion when I was younger, I always thought it happened earlier on. But when I start pulling up artists from the second British invasion, I'm like, this is the 80s. This is our time. This is, I mean, just to kind of go through, I mentioned, you got Def Leppard, Depeche Mode, Iron Maiden, Billy Idol, U2, and I think that's when we talked about that off camera. U2 is technically part of the second British invasion. I realized that they were from Ireland, but still, it's the all ties into it.
Man, and another thing that was going on in the '80s was we got MTV and color TV. I mean, people had color TVs, and you had music videos, and that was and right there waiting was people like Billy Idol.
Yeah.
Remember some of his videos.
With the teaser and all that. Yeah.
Oh man, and U2 had these videos, and these girls were so obsessed with Bono.
Oh yeah.
And
yes.
Man, I mean, you got the Pet Shop Boys. I mean, you had all these bands.
Yeah.
And groups and pop. It was blowing up.
Yes.
Duran, have you mentioned Duran? I was crazy about Duran.
Oh, I was too. Yes. And I think between MTV and I think technology, you mentioned color TV, music videos, and technology. I mean, you had synth, you had all these different technologies at your disposal now, and we mentioned last episode in part two about live music in the 70s. I think live music, you're absolutely right. Live music really expanded on that. And it just carried over into the 80s. These large arenas, pop was getting big in America. So,
and dance too. These dance clubs were just were exploding in the 80s. Coke was a big reason for that.
Of course. Of course.
If you take Coke, I've never done Coke, but I'm pretty sure, from what I've seen on TV, you can dance all night. But dance clubs were getting bigger, and what it was doing, whether it was rock or whatever venue these people chose to hear their music, people were, and it's the same thing to me that kind of happened in the '90s.
Yeah,
people started to appreciate music. Movies and stuff were big at the time too, but there's another form of entertainment in music. And I think, and that's one thing I saw even in the 90s with grunge and everything. It was more of a music movement because people really started getting into music. And you saw that in the 70s and 80s. Music would drive the entire culture. I don't know what happened with 80s fashion though.
Neon, of course.
Not good.
Neon has been around for a long time, but it felt like neon, and it wasn't just like I'm not talking about neon signs. Neon signs have been around a long time. I'm talking about neon colors, bright yellow, bright pink, in fashion. It was crazy.
Oh my God.
And we grew up in the 80s, so
Balloon
we were there.
Pants.
Oh
yeah, you'd go somewhere where there's a bunch of kids and it would just look like a blob of neon running around. It was kind of trippy.
It was.
But
when you mentioned Coke, and I realize this is more 70s, but when you mentioned Coke and dancing, I can't help but remember Starsky and Hutch, the movie, where he thinks that it's artificial sweetener, and they do that dance. I'm sorry, I just little sidetracked there with Coke. But how is it that we always manage to slip drugs in? I think because it really does play a factor. You really cannot talk about music without talking about drugs in some fashion, I don't think.
Yeah, and it's maybe music didn't evolve. Maybe the drugs just evolved.
Do you think that the drugs evolved? But did the drugs evolve music, or did music evolve the drugs? As far as the availability
That's
and like the
it's
chicken and
like
the
what
egg, I
came
know.
first, the chicken and the egg. It's the same.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think music would sound the same.
Hmm.
I mean, the Beatles they're not going to write the Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds song. They're not taking Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. You know,
They're they're not sipping herbal tea while riding Lucy in the Sky.
no, no, you don't want to write a song. Yeah, you don't want to write a song about other people doing drugs. It's about you doing drugs.
Right.
So,
Like we talked about
you know,
in our episode about grunge, you're not going to write that kind of style without crappy weather and heroin. Speaking of weather,
mm-hmm.
we have had Seattle like or Washington like weather the last week, and it makes you want to write. It makes you want to
Yeah,
not about death or anything, but just it's been some really crappy weather here in Central Texas, and it makes you
well,
think, you know.
yeah, it's been pretty crappy here too, and well, you know, when it makes I'm you're excused from yard work when it's raining. You know what I
Of
mean?
course,
Um,
yeah,
but I think I mean I'm looking for even with this new election and everything. I mean, we've had a lot of political stuff going on, and
yeah,
hopefully some good music comes out of all of this. I mean, it's a
yeah.
pretty historic time. You know what I mean?
It is, and
So
with music exploding, then I think we see it happening again now. When you have lockdowns, in fact, I don't know if it was a blog or if it was something I read, but they said that historically we have had more releases in 2020, and I can't give you any numbers or percentages, but we have had more releases because of lockdown. Musicians don't have anything else to do, and I think that
yeah,
we can take that aspect of it, look back in the 80s. I mean, plus again with technology, yeah, people were still listening to records, but now you had cassettes. Of course, in the 70s, you had 8-track, but I kind of wish we'd mentioned that back then, but we can
yeah,
mention it now. But we were listening to music on different mediums. Now we could listen to music other than the radio in our cars. We had
yeah.
8-track players. Now in the 80s, we had cassette players in our cars. Before that, it was the radio. We had so much more
Yeah,
options.
my wife and I we bought a car yesterday,
Oh
uh,
yeah.
a 2020 model, uh, and I was noticing on the test drive because for some reason I was in the back seat um, on the test drive, uh, but I noticed there's no CD player.
Nope.
There's no CD player. There's no. We
Mm-mm.
finally have reached a car where there's no. You better have a phone, or you're not going to be able to listen to the radio, of course.
Right. Right.
Um, but if you want to be specific about what you listen to, you better have a
Mm-hmm.
phone. Um, so
Yeah.
these phones, they can, so yeah, it's
Yeah.
crazy. And the
Yeah.
way a lot of the stuff in the 70s to 80s, they really got creative about how, music was packaged,
Yes.
records and photography got better.
Yeah.
Digital artwork became better. So you got to have cooler album
Mm-hmm.
covers other than just a dude, sitting there with his guitar.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, look at how much time people spent looking at the Pink Floyd Dark Side of the Moon
Yes.
cover. What does that mean? I mean, stoners have been trying to figure that out for years, dude.
Yeah. And
So,
and I'm so glad that you mentioned artwork covers. In fact, there are some albums that just because of their artwork, and we're gonna kind of take a step back
mhm.
into the '60s. Uh, Morrison Hotel from The Doors, that was a really popular cover. The Eagles had a really popular cover.
Yeah,
I think back in the '60s, you had they were trying to do different things with filters because yeah, you would have the bands standing there and they would add some kind of a filter to change the color, kind of a psychedelic. And then the '70s, like you said, photography got
hmm
better. For me, I think
yeah,
the coolest album cover I ever owned in the '80s was Guns N' Roses' "Appetite for Destruction." It was so dark. I say dark, but it was
Yeah,
dark because it had skeletons on it, had a cross. You're like, yeah, man, I want to listen to that.
yeah,
But artwork
yeah.
was getting better. And I think that we're
Hmm.
visually attracted to music, at least back then, because nowadays you say we listen to it on our phones, but back then you could walk into the music store, you haven't heard the album yet, maybe a single,
Mm-mm.
but you're visually attracted to the artwork of the cover of the CD or the cassette tape.
Yeah, and if it had a a crappy looking cover, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I always think, well, maybe the album sucks too, you know.
That's the way I
Uh,
look at. Yeah,
but
that's the way I looked at it. Yeah,
and they would but yeah, but artists would market their music on just on the cover. I mean, that was a big deal.
mm-hmm.
Because people were ingesting music in different ways, and
Mm-hmm.
musicians had to cater to that, and the
Yeah,
successful musicians were the ones that they had to play a lot of live shows. It was still a
yeah,
lot of very heavy live,
yeah,
even in the 80s. And you had I mean, and even like, when hair bands started coming around, and all hair
yeah.
metal and all of that kind of
Mm-hmm.
killed the British invasion, but
Mm-hmm.
by then, I mean, these venues were so massive. And maybe that's what needed to happen. You can't have the British invasion. It can only invade for so long. And then
Yeah.
it's time for the next wave of whatever music is coming. So
It's
now we're just
almost,
sitting here
yeah.
waiting to see what's next on our end.
It's almost
You
like
know,
the second British invasion, which it wasn't the same as the first. The first, I mean, of course, anytime,
right?
and you can say that with movies, the first one's always the best. The '60s British invasion, the first British invasion, was by far the
Yeah.
best. Anything first is the best. It's almost like
Hmm.
they were, from a marketing standpoint, they said, okay, well, we've got these bands are kind of getting some or making some traction in England. Well, let's bring them over to the States, like U2, for instance,
Yeah.
or Iron Maiden, Depeche Mode. And it's like, I think marketing got better too. I mean, if you think about it,
Yeah.
no longer were you just buying an album. Now you start having bundles, and then eventually you started having VHS. You could actually, of course, this may be towards the mid to late '80s, but I remember you could like watch a VHS tape of a live show.
I used to do that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd go to video stores and rent concerts, and it was the coolest
Yes.
thing
Yes.
because now we can if you weren't fortunate enough to go to a concert, you could at least get
Yes.
close. And it became, the relationship with the music. I mean, there's, people that follow like the Beatles or the Stones or
Hmm.
any of those guys. It's almost like a cult following at the same time.
Yeah.
There's people that, there are some pretty serious Beatles fans out there.
Oh yeah.
You know, I mean that they're, they'll fight you any day over a Beatles conversation.
Oh
It
yeah.
gets pretty thick.
Oh
So
yeah. Beetle,
it's a whole
Beetle
other
fanboys.
world, man.
It is, and that's where we're at now. And I think it's really important to talk about in our three-part series, just to mention, where we are
Yeah,
today.
here we are. And now it's up to us to kind of take all of that. I mean, music, I think it snowballs.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure you hear a little bit of Texas blues in my playing as yours as well. The stuff that we're British stuff, rock. I mean, it all comes out. And so we're rounded third and we're crossing a home plate.
Nice. So we want to thank you for watching our three-part series of the British invasion. We'll see you next time.
We'll see you next time.